Hi, this is Claudia Sam, and I am happy to share with you today a talk that I recently gave at the Forecasters Club of New York. The title of the talk is A Curious Kind of Cycle, as in a business cycle, and I'm focusing on the labor market dynamics since the pandemic. I know there's a lot of interest in where is the US labor market headed. And what I argue in this talk is I think it's really important to think back over the last 5.5 years and set this in context. The inspiration for the talk, and in particular the inspiration for the title, came from a interpretation, a label that Fed Chair Jay Powell has put on the current labor market, where he's referred to it as having a curious kind of balance. So these are remarks that he gave in August at Jackson Hole. So overall, while the labor market appears to be in balance, it is a curious kind of balance that results from a market slowing in both the supply of and demand for workers. This is an unusual situation that suggests downside risks to employment are rising. And if those risks materialize, they can do so quickly in the form of sharply higher layoffs and rising unemployment. So that's a description of the labor market. I'm going to put some pictures to it that kind of show what he's talking about. And here we see payroll employment in the top left. The black line is the 3-month moving average of the change in payrolls. And you can see that it has slowed sharply this year. And if you take also into account the likely revisions that we'll see at the next annual benchmark, that slowing probably started even earlier. That's the light blue line, the dashed line. But in any case, we've seen, a real slowing in job creation, practically to a crawl in the data that we have through August. Now, at the same time, the unemployment rate, so to the top right, has risen over the past year, but just barely. Really not, nothing as dramatic as the slowing that we've seen in job creation. That can give you this curious balance where, the demand for workers has really fallen off, but at the same time, the supply has fallen off. Maybe not quite as much as demand, but that can get you a case where, the unemployment rate is rising, but not substantially, at least not yet. And then looking at it in terms of movement in the labor market, that bottom left chart shows the low hire, low fire labor market that we've heard a lot about over the past year. And there we can see the hiring rate, the green line, is notably below and has been for some time the rate right before the pandemic. But by the same token, the layoff rate, the orange line, has been unusually low. So that also, sets us up with this kind of balance. And then there is the risk if layoffs were to spike in a low hiring environment, potentially we could see the unemployment rate move quickly. But it is worth noting, low hire, low fire, this has been with us for some time, well over a year at this point. And the last piece at the high level is, we look at wage growth. And here we see that there has been slowing. There's been slowing over quite some time now, but it's nothing dramatic. So again, if you had a sharp deterioration in the demand for labor, well, we would expect wage growth to really take a leg down and move down more sharply. That's not what we're seeing here. But by the same token, if labor supply were really, the whole story, and we had labor shortages, then we would expect wage growth to pick up. Now, if you drill in, this is all at a very high level. If you drill in under and look at industries or demographics of workers, you can tell some different stories. But just to give, this is the sense of the curious balance that we have right now. And of course, the big question is, do we stay in balance and where does this go? But I also thought when using the word curious, it really struck with me that there are many times in the last 5.5 years since the pandemic began that we've had curiosities in the labor market. So something curious doesn't mean it's inexplicable. It's unusual, maybe a little bit surprising. And so I put together a list, and this is just a short list and very narrowly focused on the labor market. That one curiosity in the beginning, and this really was quite a pleasant surprise, is this was the first job full recovery since 1980s. Starting with the 1990 recession, we had seen the recovery in employment lag after the recovery in output or GDP began. Not this time. This was a very short-lived recession, and when output started coming back, employment did too. And we saw very quickly returning to pre-pandemic levels of employment. So that's the first piece, or first curiosity. Another one is there was notable wage compression. So there was a period early in the recovery where low-wage workers were making real gains in terms of their bargaining power, in terms of their wage gains, their ability to move to other jobs. And just in general, we saw a lot of churn in the labor market, and even in some cases, labor shortages. So that was a piece, the Great Resignation. That was often how that was described and of interest. And then we got to a place where, we had all this going on in the labor market. Things were really, really had heated up. And at the same time, we saw inflation was well above what we had been used to pre-pandemic. And so there were a lot of concerns that the only way to rebalance the labor market, the only way to get inflation down, was going to be with a recession. And the historical record was on the side of the skeptics at that point. But we didn't have a recession, right? And inflation did come down, not all the way back to normal, but it came down substantially. We saw a lot of rebalancing in the labor market. A lot of things cooled off, and yet it didn't go cold. We didn't go into a recession. And then finally, the current period, as we talked about, this low hire, low fire labor market movements in supply and demand. So I just think it's worth noting that there are a whole set of curiosities that we have been served up in this business cycle. And so then the key takeaways from the talk today, and I'll go into all of this in more detail, but the key takeaways are, the current labor market conditions. So this question we started with about the curious balance in the labor market today in 2025, we should be evaluating those questions in the context of what has been an unusual cycle. And I'll argue is some of what we're seeing today, some of the cooling off, it's still normalization happening, right? That we're still kind of getting back to something that looks like normal after this cycle. And so I think it's important. We got to keep the context. While we're looking forward, we have to keep the context of the last 5.5 years. Another piece that I'm going to, develop is this idea that really paying attention to what's happening with labor supply is important. And while there were major shifts in demand during this cycle, right, with fiscal policy, monetary policy, I mean, you name it, there were just a lot of disruptions, and then those unwinding. We have also seen some really unusual and unexpected changes in labor supply that time and again have made it difficult or kind of given us a head fake in some of our typical measures of the business cycle. The typical measures of, is a recession here? Is a recession coming? I mean, the Sahm rule is in this camp, but largely because the unemployment rate has been often difficult to interpret because we have these changes in labor supply. And one last, maybe a little more wonky or wishful point that I'd like to make with this talk is it is really important then for our cyclical analysis, like what's happening in the business cycle, if we had better, more timely, more consistent measures of labor supply. At this point, I'd like to see any government data, but I do think there are some ways that we could improve upon the measures of labor supply, which would then let us kind of isolate what's happening in terms of the ups and downs in the economy. Okay, so now I'm going to go through some of these curiosities, lay out some data that you see with pictures. So first of all, this job full recovery, the blue line is the most recent cycle. There's a whole set of these charts I'm going to show you, but they're all start at the cycle peak. So that's, the peak of activity right before the recession began. That's the level that'll be the 100 in each of these. And I'm going to show you, different recessions. Each line is a recession. So they're all indexed back to the peak of the cycle. And then it looks at month by month, and this goes for about 5.5 years, so the period that we've had so far since the pandemic recession began, and looks at what is the level of employment now at any point in time here relative to the cycle peak. And what you can see is that with the pandemic recession, employment plunged relative to the more recent recessions. But the other thing, and this is the job full recovery piece, is that despite having much larger decrease in employment, we saw in this recovery employment regain the level of its prior peak the soonest of our recession since 1990. These are the 1990, 2001, 2008, 2009. Those are considered the jobless recoveries. So in this case, we had a job full recovery. We had a rapid recovery. Now you will see that blue line kind of bends towards the end, and I will you could characterize this as a job full recovery that moved into a jobless expansion. But again, I think it is important not just to focus on that flattening out of the line out in 2025, where we are now, but in the context of, there'd been a very rapid recovery. Now, for this chart and then the ongoing ones, I'm going to bring in all of the recessions since 1948, or at least where the data are available. And here you can see, so this is employment again, so same chart as one before. The blue line again is this cycle. What's notable here are the historic drop in employment during the recession. The speed of the recovery doesn't stand out as much. Again, not just comparing it to the jobless recoveries, but it is, notable given how deep the recession was in terms of employment, how quickly it came back. Now, if we look at this in terms of the unemployment rate, despite historic increases, and that rise probably is even understated relative to what happened during the pandemic recession, unemployment, while it rose rapidly and dramatically, in terms of returning to its level before the recession, in this cycle, it happened basically the fastest. I mean, with one or two exceptions, right? And so this fits in with that very rapid recovery, and it is going to, and we'll come back to this time and again, how we interpret what this unemployment rate means, and maybe how things got overheated. Now, there were a lot of temporary layoffs right at the beginning of the recession, and those people were brought back pretty quickly as it turned out that the economy started to reopen. But it wasn't just about the temporary layoffs. It also was the case that for those who were permanently laid off, there was a large increase. Actually, the permanent layoffs in the Great Recession ended up being larger, in percent terms than in the pandemic recession, but they were substantial. And again, this, even for those who were permanently laid off, you saw a very rapid recovery. So getting those numbers back down, and notably faster. So we saw, again, this cycle was different in that you saw layoffs very rapidly and then very rapidly reversing. Now, and there are a lot of pieces to that. And again, I'm going to set a lot of the demand side factors to the side. And I do want to emphasize today, just because I think we should be thinking about as well, the supply side. And this chart shows you the labor force. Again, same exercise, looking at the level of the labor force right before the recession began, up until as the months go on after the recession. And what you can see here is, just like with employment, there was a historic drop at the beginning of the recession, and those are probably almost certainly tied together. We know that a path out of the labor force is losing one's job, right? And so when employment declines, it's not surprising to see the labor force also declining. But what we can see here, unlike the rapid recovery we saw in employment, the rapid decline in the unemployment rate, the labor force is very slow to recover. And so there's a period there early in the recovery where the labor force is notably less relative to 2019, or notably less relative to other recessions that we've seen. And so that's, the labor force isn't exactly a measure of supply, because we certainly can have people come in from outside the labor force, but it does tell you that um, we didn't the composition of the work, like the supply, it wasn't the same. And then later we see the labor force really, starts to pick up. And I'll go more about some of the underlying features, but you can see that eventually we do have a labor force that's larger than it was before the pandemic, but it took quite some time to get there. Now, let's dig into what could be happening with the labor force, with labor supply. And first of all, I think it's important to remember this business cycle was set off by a pandemic. This was a public health crisis. It was an illness, right? It was and very much directed at workers. There's a lot of uh, work digging into this. I highlight a recent paper by Dennett and co-authors that looks at the current population survey. So this is what underlies the unemployment rate, the household survey. And, they show that health-related absences from work rose sharply during the pandemic. Their paper is very recent. It shows how it continues to track with COVID outbreaks measured in the water supply, like if there's an outbreak. So this very much had COVID created these, um, absences from work, which would be kind of like a temporary hit to labor supply. But what they also show in their research is that labor force exits after a health event have been elevated in since the pandemic began. And that's what this chart is here, to the on this slide. And the vertical dash lines, this is the start of the pandemic and then the end of the public health emergency. And so you can see in that period that if people had a health event, they were more likely to exit the labor force. So again, reinforcing that, I mean, we had a pandemic. It very directly affected the health of some individuals, and that those negative effects on their health that led to people leaving the labor force, and in some case, temporarily during their having the health event, having COVID, but also there were some very persistent effects as well. And another way to try to think about labor supply is to look at, the hours that people are willing to work. This is some really interesting research by Faberman and a set of colleagues, many of them connected with the New York Fed, at least at some point in time. And that the survey of consumer expectations, which gets a lot of attention, it has some inflation expectation measures, but they also run a whole battery of questions about the labor market. And there's an annual survey that they do on job search, and they have for several years collected information about how much people wanted to work, so desired hours. So in addition to how many hours people are working, and what they found is that after the pandemic began, so in 2020 and 2021, their annual surveys picked up a drop in the desired work hours. And so again, this could be a kind of a less labor supply. People aren't willing to work. And in particular, the decline was concentrated. Excuse me, the decline was concentrated among individuals not in the labor force who normally would have preferred to work some, and those working part-time. So this is about, that again, like I said, the labor supply, we don't have there's not an easy statistic on this, because it's, who's just because you aren't working doesn't mean you aren't willing to work. But this survey tries to get at that by asking people what their interest, and they also, tying back to the other point about this was a pandemic, they found that people who worked in jobs with higher social contact, so should be, exposure to the pandemic, they expressed larger declines in their desired hours than people who didn't have a lot of social contact in their work. So it does seem to have connections um, back to the pandemic. And again, it's kind of people on the margins, people who aren't in the labor force, people who are working part-time. And then what they do in their research is take these survey responses about desired work hours, then they map them into the current population survey, which is much larger. And then they compare there to hours worked and get a measure of aggregate hours, both actual and desired. And what they call this, the orange line is the aggregate hours gap. And what is to note here is that even as the unemployment rate, and these are indexed to their levels right in 2018 and 2019, the unemployment rate, even though it was coming down rapidly, this aggregate hours gap was coming down even faster because again, you had these people on the periphery of the labor market who were no longer interested in being in the labor market or being as intensively in the labor market. And so this is could be an explanation of why the unemployment rate actually was telling us that there was a lot more slack, or there was more, there were more workers out there that needed jobs than was actually the case, or was overstating it because these relationships about, people on the periphery, that those were changing. And this could help explain why, even though the unemployment rate after the pandemic got down to levels, 3.5%, that really weren't that far off of pre-pandemic, the labor market really heated up. And so this could be an explanation of why the unemployment rate wasn't quite capturing how strong, maybe, overly strong the labor market was, because it wasn't taking into account these desired hours. Okay, so now turning to another curiosity, and I'm kind of putting both sides of this together. This is about the churn in the labor market, this massive amount of movement. So what the chart is showing are the hiring rate, the blue line, and the separation rate is the red line. So employers bringing on workers, workers leaving employers. Those gray shaded areas. So each of those are lined up with the start of a recession. And I've got the 2001, the 2008, and the 2020. And the shading is 5.5 years. So I'm kind of trying to visually line up the current period, which we've got about 5.5 years after the pandemic start, with the other two. And so what you can see here is this cycle has been very abrupt, right? You had movements in the hiring and the separation rate that are off the scale, right, at the very beginning of the pandemic. But then early in the recovery saw churn, a high degree of churn, high hiring rates, high separation rates, and then a big drop off, right? And so now we're in this period where they're much lower. Okay, but you have kind of these extremes. Whereas if you look after the Great Recession in the first 5.5 years, the hiring rate, the separation rate, they stepped down and they remained very low, right? And it took many years kind of for those to recover to their pre-pandemic levels. So you had kind of a very different picture. This time we had a big jump in churn and then a slowing, and last time we had a big drop in churn and then a gradual recovery. And the 2001 recession is a much smoother one in terms of a pretty stable degree of hiring and firing. And so the point here is that, we talk about right now having a low hire, low fire environment, but it's worth keeping it in context. For the cycle as a whole, the 5.5 years as a whole, this is a high amount of churn, a high amount of hiring and firing. And that's, the table shows kind of the averages of those rates in the different, the first 5 years after the different recessions. And, this one stands out because we had such an enormous amount of churn early in the recovery. And even if you give the recovery after the Great Recession its full span from 2008 to 2020, it still is a very sluggish labor market compared to the current one. And another way, I mean, this is just kind of looking at the aggregate patterns. If we look, say, at industries, you can also make this point about normalization. So if we take the quits rate, which that's the rate at which employees are choosing to leave firm, not being laid off, they're choosing to leave firms, and often for a different job, but it's a separation by choice. If you look at the industries that had the highest degree of quits, and that's often like how strong like the that industry, the labor market is, the highest degree of quits in the 2021-2022 period, those industries are more likely to be at the lower end of the quits rates in 2023 and 2025. So again, this is consistent with normalization, or consistent with, there could be less hiring or even layoffs among firms that did a lot of hiring earlier in the pandemic. So I'm not arguing that this explains it all and that we shouldn't be concerned about the low hire, low fire environment right now. What I'm arguing here is that we need to keep it in the context of what has been a very dynamic labor market with a lot of hiring and a lot of separations. Okay, so now, we've set the stage that we had this high degree of churn in the labor market. We had a labor market that was really strong, if not overheated, early in the recovery. And we know, elsewhere that inflation had picked up quite a bit, and unemployment was very low. So as we got into 2022, and this was pretty clear that, things seemed out of balance. Like you had a lot of strength in the labor market, you had inflation is higher, unemployment was very low, we had some labor shortages. The argument was made that the only way to get back to balance was with the recession. And this analysis from Olivier Blanchard and co-authors is looking at kind of slicing up what's referred to as the Beveridge curve. So in each of these charts, it shows the unemployment rate on the x-axis and the vacancy rate. So these are job postings as a percent of the labor force. So that's the y-axis. And they're looking at different cycles of the vacancy rate. These are all different periods in time, and kind of looking at, what's the peak of that vacancy rate? What does it look like in terms of the vacancy rate itself? What does it look like in terms of unemployment in the 8 quarters or 2 years before the peak in the vacancy rate? And what does it look like in the 8 quarters after the peak in the vacancy rate? And that after the peak, that's these orange lines, that's kind of the rebalancing. And what they argued this was a piece from 2022, is that if you look at each of these charts, all those orange lines, which do get the vacancy rate down, they're coming down on the y-axis, they all are associated with a pretty substantial increase in the unemployment rate. So that orange line kind of tails out to the right. And what they argue is, well, that's what we're going to see again, which would be a recession. Okay, so that was not what happened. The chart, the kind of inset chart there to the right, I recreate, the way they set up these calculations, but with the data that we have since then. And what you can see is, well, I mean, everything was pretty dramatic in the 8 quarters up to the peak in 2022, the first quarter of 2022. But since then, we had a really large decrease in the vacancy rate. So it did come down quite a bit, and unemployment edged up, right? It did increase, but very little. So, and why was that? Right. And there's a lot of different answers to that question. But one thing that the analysis that they did, and they were very clear about this in their paper as well, is that, that the unemployment rate was kind of capturing all of the excess, or like where all the workers could come from, to kind of, that it was really the best measure of slack. But as we showed before, like there were changes in terms of how many people outside the labor force wanted to work, how many hours people wanted to work. So part of this could just be that the unemployment rate actually wasn't as good of an indicator as it has been in the past, because it really wasn't capturing the where that easing up could come from. And in particular, we do know that in the period after this, we had a big increase in the labor supply coming through immigration. I mean, so in part we were able to, fill some of these vacancies with additional workers. Now, I want to be clear, it wasn't just analysis with the Beveridge curve. And there were people that looked at that very differently. Fed Governor Chris Waller is an exception to that. But, that kind of analysis wasn't the only that kind of misjudged the business cycle coming in in recent years. So I also, the Sahm rule, which is based on changes in the unemployment rate, it also triggered in 2024, just barely, but it did trigger. And, so that in that it reached a level that was consistent with previous recessions. In the early months of recessions, there were other, I mean, there's a whole set of business cycle indicators that started flashing red in 2024, if not sooner. So some rule is not unique, but I do want to point out that that the unemployment rate, using the changes in unemployment rate, which has generally been pretty accurate, just like using changes in the vacancy rate had been often quite accurate. It did not prove to be the case this time. And as I mentioned, with the kind of vacancy rate analysis, I think shifts in labor supply are likely part of what muddled the cyclical cycle or cyclical signal from changes in the unemployment rate. And again, I think immigration is one likely candidate. And it's not just, this is just showing you that, in fact, the labor force swung in unexpected ways in the past 5.5 years. So as I, showed you very early on, you had a big decrease in the labor force, and these are the orange line is the actual labor force. You can index back to the fourth quarter of 2019, so right before the pandemic. And that dashed blue line is the CBO forecast that was in January of 2020. So this was kind of like what was expected before we knew anything about the pandemic and what it unleashed on the economy. And so you can see there was a period for, the first up through 2022, where the labor force was quite a bit less than had been expected prior to the pandemic. So that's, I think, a period where it was adding to labor shortages, adding, we didn't have the labor force growth that was expected. It probably was, could have been adding to the tightness in the labor market because you didn't have the workers that were expected. And even though we had a very rapid recovery, reflecting a rapid recovery in demand, but then when we got in the later period, so starting in like 2023, the labor force actually was above what we would have expected before the pandemic. And this, I talked about early on, there were, pandemic related effects on the labor force. And then we went into a period of very high immigration, which is now reversing. So, and that's not fully reflected in these published statistics. But that swing, and I do think the big increase in immigration probably was enough to, as the unemployment rate was rising in 2024, part of that rise was from a good reason. We had more workers, and it takes time to get them jobs, and so the unemployment rate temporarily is higher, and that's about more supply of workers and not a weakening of demand, though that was in play also. And so, this was enough, and these are big unexpected changes to cause some difficulty interpreting our typical cyclical indicators. And one thing I wanted to measure, and this was kind of my wonky takeaway, is it's difficult to measure labor supply. We talked about kind of some of the alternative measures, like these, looking at desired work hours. But even some of our, the measures like the labor force or population growth, like things that feed into what would be the potential supply of workers, they can be really hard like our to measure those in real time. And when we have big changes in the labor force, that gets even more complicated. So oops, sorry. What this is showing here is the Congressional Budget Office. They make a forecast of different demographic factors, including immigration. And what I'm just showing you here is how quickly things changed. They had when they did their forecast in January of 2025, they kind of definitely expected immigration to come down, but more gradually, whereas the forecast that they made in the fall of this year shows like a dramatic, like kind of straight down decline in the number of immigrants. So, but those, because we learned, policy, we have a new administration, it was much more restrictive on immigration. So these policy changes happen very quickly, but the population estimates that are in the current population survey, so the household survey that we use to get like the unemployment rate, other kind of demographic employment information, those estimates of the population were done last year, well before we saw these policy changes in place. And so it does cause some friction in we know immigration is happening. There are lots of, analyses out there, estimates. This feeds into a discussion about what's the break-even rate of employment. And yet we don't have in the official statistics a real-time update to these population controls. So we're going to see revisions, and the way these are done, they get put in once a year, and they're not all consistent historically. So I think given the fact that, we went through a cycle where big changes in the labor supply, including coming from population growth changes, like this just underscores how important it would be to have more timely, more centralized, because it's in the government figures, like we're all kind of looking at the same information, that it could be in terms of answering questions like we're trying to right now. Where is the labor market headed? Like, are we headed towards a recession? So these kind of questions about the cycle, it'd be a lot easier to isolate demand if we had better, more timely measures of supply. Great. All right. Well, so in conclusion, first and foremost, beware of any quote unquote sure signs of a recession. I think one we could see soon, or we've even had a discussion, is sizable monthly declines in payrolls are a guaranteed sign of a recession. That's historically that may be true. History hasn't been a reliable guide in this cycle. And I think, we've talked about some reasons why this has been a curious kind of cycle. I think we're probably still in that phase. So just, beware of any sure signs. And then I think it is still the case that we need to keep current conditions in the context of the cycle. We are not, there's a lot that's happened in the last 5.5 years, and normalization is a long process. So we should think about that when we, think about today's labor market. What was it in 2022 is still a relevant consideration. We got to keep thinking about labor supply. I don't think it's the whole show, and we certainly don't want to miss shifts in demand, but it is something to keep in context, or to keep thinking about labor supply. And as an example with this, like I have been, very much watching changes in the unemployment rate, but also knowing that because immigration has slowed down as much as it has, it's probably that labor supply is pushing down on the unemployment rate this time. Last year was pushing up on it. So I don't, if I'm not waiting to see a SOM roll hit 0.5, right now it's more like 0.1, because, the supply is having an effect. By the same token, I think the supply side of this is a real thing, and I do not expect a recession. I don't see that in the cards right now, though there are risks. But it's important to keep thinking about supply. And then, finally, as I said, I don't see the path to a recession, but the current low hire, low fire labor market is a less resilient labor market. It's one where it would be a lot harder to buffer a negative shock. In 2022, when the Fed began aggressively raising interest rates, the labor market was really strong. It was able, I mean, and it was able to cool off without falling into a recession. I think a negative shock, something that we haven't seen yet, but comes at the economy. There's a long list of possibilities. This is a time where we don't have the same resilience. And so I think it is appropriate to think of this as a risky labor market, but I don't see this, but by the same token, given what we know right now, and it is limited because there's less government data, uh, it's not a recessionary labor market. Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate all of it, and any comments, feedback would be very much welcome. Thank you.